late autumn storm crawling over the Ozark foothills of Indian Territory. Thunder rolls like wagon wheels over slate ridges. Wind rips through blackjack oak and flings sleet against a half-built one-room cabin, 4 stone courses high, roofless, mortar freezing in the joints. A lone woman hauls another fieldstone from a creek whose banks bite away under ice. Vultures tilt low, testing the air as if the ridge itself were dying. Eleanor Pike, a widowed settler, left with a forged deed and a promised spring, has built alone for 9 weeks while the ranch heir, who sponsored her, has vanished with her savings. Her only water is the disputed creek that freezes before dawn. Her nearest neighbor is a grave at the tree line. She is one storm from losing everything until a Cherokee hunter steps from the woods, wordless, and lifts the other end of her stone. She thinks he might be rescue. He is not. At dusk, a rider tops the ridge, deputy star flashing, and the man who claims her land rides at his side. Their papers name Eleanor, a trespasser, but the rider who appeared at dusk was no savior. This account survives in a Fort Smith court packet, where one name is cut away with a knife, a mission register bearing a thumbprint instead of a signature, and a coroner's inquest stained dark along the fold. Keep watch. The missing name, the thumbprint, and the stain belong to the same night, and to the hand that set the trap. She set her back against the wind and lifted, fingers numb inside split gloves, the stone slick with half ice and creek silt. The man across from her lifted too, like they were sharing a quiet oath without words, and together they walked it to the wall. He eased it down into the bed of mortar and tapped with his knuckles, listening with his bones for the right sound. The ridge groaned under the weather. The smell of wet limestone and wood smoke slipped through the sleet like a thin soup. "Mortar'll crack at night," he said, breath ghosting. "You'll need heat in the joints." She wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist. "I've got coals enough if the wind quits stealing them." He nodded toward the creek, toward a clutch of low trees that broke the gusts. "Stones want to be warm together, or they'll pull apart." He spoke like a man minding a story that was older than his own name. He laid the old bone ruler across the course and watched the bubble in the little glass tube as if it were a live thing, deciding their luck. Eleanor had carried stones all afternoon, and the ache in her shoulders felt like a question that had only one answer. She did not trust the answer, so she kept working. The creek bit at its banks with a steady patience, taking a sliver here, a sliver there, and she thought of time chewing a widow down to the hard parts. When she bent to scoop sand with the shovel, wind sluiced sleet into the open collar of her coat. She gritted her teeth and held on to the rhythm that had kept her upright these 9 weeks. Lift, carry, set, tamp, breathe. The man watched her long enough to learn her pace, and then matched it. He worked as if speaking would waste strength they needed to spend on the wall. Only once did he give his name, and it came like a stone set, polite. "Saloli Ridge," she said, "Eleanor Pike," and waited for the change that names bring. Nothing changed. They moved another stone. By late afternoon, the mud had a skin of ice where her boots had broken it, and the vultures writhed in the updraft like scraps of burned paper that would not come down. The grave at the tree line sat under a sheet of thin sleet, the little wooden cross leaning where the post hole had widened in the first rain of autumn. She had carved his name with a pocket knife and had done it in a hurry because the flies came fast during that warm week, and she could not stand the sound. Ezra Pike, Reverend, husband, beloved, had not fit between the splinters of the board. She did not look at it now because each glance opened a seam she had tried to mortar shut. She looked at the wall instead and tried to think like stone. When the hoofbeats came, she heard them long before she lifted her head. The rhythm was deputy clean, not cowhand loose. She set the trowel down because she did not want to be holding a blade when the badge arrived. That was a trick she'd learned in a different life, how men looked harder at a woman with steel in her hand than at a man with steel in his. Deputy Isaac Harlan's coat had rain marks that had dried and come wet again and dried again, like a map of how far the badge had been in a season. His boots were careful. He rode like a man who measured notches on the law, the way a carpenter measured beam length. Caleb Merritt rode at his side in a good hat he had not earned, and a way of sitting a saddle that said he thought all land ought to flatten under him. 2 hired hands trailed, looking bored because men like that kept their fear for dark. Harlan lifted 2 papers out of his coat, careful not to let sleet melt, stain the ink. "Ma'am," he said, voice even, "I have here a deputy's return and a claim confirmation bearing Mr. Merritt's seal, notarized in Fort Smith, stating that—" Caleb took the rest, smiling, because he liked to be the one who ended other people's sentences. "Stating that this spring and the ground around it fall under my prior survey. I did tell you, Mrs. Pike, you were welcome to my sponsorship while we settled matters. It grieves me that matters did not settle." Sleet pocked the paper like moth bites. Eleanor wiped her nose on her sleeve and looked at the lines without really seeing them. "You took my savings and promised a survey that does not exist." Caleb chuckled. "Promises take the shape of paper, ma'am. I've got the paper." Harlan looked like a man who had heard too many versions of the same joke and had learned to keep the shape of his face plain while it landed. Saloli said nothing. He kept his hands by his sides, empty, where everyone could see them. The 2 hired men dismounted and walked to the wall, and on Caleb's nod, set their boots against the bottom course and pushed like boys, wrecking another boy's fort. The wall shuddered. Eleanor took 2 steps before she realized what she was doing, and then she did not stop, because the body knows its own ideas better than the mind's ideas. She grabbed a hired man's sleeve, and he backhanded her. Not cruel, just bored. She went down to a knee and came up again, quick enough to make the man blink. "Leave it," she said, voice low. "Leave my wall." The man laughed and pushed harder, and the wall let go, where the mortar had cooled to chalk. The stones sloughed. In the space where mercy should have been, Saloli's knife licked out and took the man's wrist at the soft part where a bracelet would sit. Just a flash to make blood jump, but not a cut that would end a life. The hired man yelped and stumbled back and sat down hard in the sleet. The first blood hit the snow like a bright word no one wanted to read aloud. Harlan's hand found his revolver. He did not lift it, but he set his palm on it, like a man laying a hymn book on a table before the hymn starts. "Hold," he said, and the word made more space than any other had that day. Caleb's smile twitched. He had wanted the wall wrecked without trouble, so he could own victory, like a hat that fit. "Deputy," he said, "serve the vacate and be done." Harlan did what papers require. He read. He explained. He gave the line about first light. He did not look at Eleanor when he said it, and that saved them both a kind of shame. Eleanor stood with sleet in the ends of her hair, cut cheek pinking, and felt fear seat itself in the old chair, under her ribs, where it liked to sit. She did the count she did when fear came to stay. 1 stove, 4 courses of stone, 2 sacks of flour, 1 creek, 1 grave, 1 pocket Bible, 1 woman. Then she added for the first time, 1 man who had lifted the other end of a stone when she needed it lifted. She did not know what it meant to add him. She only knew the numbers felt heavier now and better in the hand. When the men rode down to their fire, the ridge breathed a little, the way a beating pauses between beats. Saloli looked at the wall's wound, as if it were a shoulder separated in a fall. "We'll heat the joints," he said. "Make the stones forget they were apart." Eleanor nodded and went to the hearth pit and coaxed the coals alive with breath and thin cedar. And when the flame took, she fed it small and steady, like a baby that needed careful tending, or it would choke. Saloli banked coals along the bottom course, tucked hot stones against the seam, covered them with ash. He showed her how the heat would climb into the mortar and knit it overnight. He told her the name for neighbors working together, Gadugi, and he said it as if saying it could make it so. "I don't take charity," she said. He nodded. "Neither do I give it. Stone for stone, bread for bread, creek for creek." "It's not your creek," she said, and it came out harder than she meant. He took that hardness and set it aside like a stone he could use later. "It's not yours either," he said, and somehow his voice did not make that a threat. It remembers other names. That night the siege began in small ways that pretended not to be siege. Someone upstream tossed rocks into the narrow run where the creek slipped between banks, and the water's voice changed from a hush to a choke. Rawhide loosened on her ridgepole where she had tied it tight, a knot she knew she had wet and pulled. To set lay, open like a mouth. A bundle sat at her threshold at dawn, hawk feathers bound with ash, and a single strand of dark hair, which said what it wanted to say without a letter. Eleanor did not know the language, but she knew a frame when she saw one. Saloli stared at the bundle a long time. "Mean hands," he said. "Mean because they're scared." A wolf print filled with meltwater on the path to the spring. The sleet had turned to a fine, needling rain that seemed to come up out of the ground rather than down from the sky, and the wall wept in it. Eleanor warmed her palms over a skillet and ate a heel of bread, hard enough to tap like wood. Saloli showed her a trick to lay stones dry, where mortar would not take the frost. Thin plates overlapped like fish scales, small chalks set to lock their anger in place. He slid a coal along the seam with a stick and smiled when the water hissed and fled. "Stones listen if you tell them true," he said. She wanted to ask how he knew stones better than people. She did not ask, because questions take more trust than she had coin for. At mid-morning, she walked to the mission at Park Hill, because a woman has to place herself sometimes in a room with a table and a person who writes things down. Sister Agnes was at her ledger, and her spectacles had fogged where breath met cold, and she wiped them with a linen square, kept folded into neat quarters. The mission smelled of lye and broth and old books. Eleanor stood on the threshold too long, and the sister looked up with the kind of welcome that makes a person sorry for all the hours they lived without it. "You're wet through," Sister Agnes said, and Eleanor said, "Only on the outside, because humor keeps a woman from breaking where the world expects it." She sat. She told it plain. The false sponsorship, the missing savings, the badge, the first blood in snow. The sister listened with her head bent, as if it were a prayer. And when Eleanor finished, she said, "I have a page you ought to see." She turned to a section she kept under a linen, because some pages feel the cold more than others, and have to be covered. Reverend Ezra Pike came through before the first frost, she said, voice soft. He brought a pocket ledger and asked me to copy a note into our register because his hands shook. He told me he had made a temporary sale of water rights to Mr. Caleb Merritt for debt, to be redeemed by spring. He could not manage his name that day. She set her finger on a brown thumbprint where a signature should be. He pressed this instead. The ink had bled at the ridges of the print, like a small, tired river flooding the low parts. Eleanor put 2 fingers to it, as if she could feel the whirls through the paper. She could not. The paper felt smooth where it should have been rough, as if someone had rubbed the print later to smudge it. Sister Agnes watched her, and then pointed to the margin, where the ink had a faint gray shine. "Looks like oil to me," she said. "Someone handled this with a thumb, not their own. There's a seal broken on a letter too. One reverend left with me, naming a benefactor who would help him clear the debt by winter. Only the seal is not whole now." She opened a small drawer and pulled a folded letter without a name on the front, the center broken clean and re-glued with clumsy wax. "I keep records," she said simply, and there was a goodness in it that did not pretend to be any more than it claimed. Eleanor could not read the name. It had been cut out with a knife so neat the page did not tear. The cut shape lay there like a mouth without teeth. "You may look," Sister Agnes said, "and you may decide how we write what happens next." Deputy Harlan sat in a saloon at the edge of Fort Smith that smelled of sawdust and rain and boiled beef. He held his deputy's return and did not put his name where it asked for it. He had written a lot of names in his years and had learned where ink can change a life more than a bullet. He looked at the door because he expected it to open and for Merritt to walk in with a smile carrying money that wanted the kind of service paper knows how to give. He looked at the bar mirror and watched his own face not look back at him. He folded the paper and slid it into his coat and stared at a letter he kept in another pocket, the one with the cut name. He could see the person who had done the cutting, clean, patient, sure. He could almost hear the little rasp of knife teeth against paper grain. He drank, and it did nothing but warm his mouth and then leave. On the ridge, Atsa came like weather, sharp and quick and unwilling to sit. He looked at Eleanor the way a hawk looks at a motion in the grass. He did not greet first. He said to Saloli, "You bring trouble home." He said to Eleanor, "Your man signed away water he could not pay for." Eleanor felt the slap of that and let it land. He pressed a thumb because his hands shook, she said. Atsa spit into the sleet like a man paying a tax. Then he should have held his hands still until they learned. Saloli set a palm on Atsa's shoulder without looking at him. The younger man stood the way steel stands before it decides to bend or break. "We will fix the dam," Saloli said. "We'll set the wall. We'll not feed fear." Atsa shook the hand off and glared at Eleanor and saw something in her that changed what he said next. He did not say sorry. He said to Saloli, "They left a bundle at the door, feathers and ash, men with small minds and knives cut off from their mothers." Eleanor did not know whether that was an insult or a lament. The wind set its teeth in the ridge and shook. Dawn came brown. The creek ran like something sick. Mud belched around the bend and drifted down like old soup. Eleanor stepped into the shallows with her skirt hitched and felt the water push like a drunk shouldering through a crowd. She saw the drag of a boot in the mud where a man had lost his balance, and then the gray shape of him, face down against the stones where the wall had fallen yesterday. She stood very still because a certain stillness keeps a person from screaming. Saloli was at her side in 2 steps. They flipped the body with hands that had done that job before. The cut across the scalp was clean and shallow. The pockets were empty. Harlan's horse huffed behind them. He had come on a quiet line of trail because a badge knows when to step soft. He looked down and read the scene like a ledger. "You know him?" Eleanor asked. Harlan nodded once. "Hired hand of Mr. Merritt's." He knelt and touched the cut and lifted the man's limp wrist. "This is made for pointing," he said, "at the wrong man." He did not look at Saloli when he said wrong. That took a different kind of courage than drawing a gun. That night, they crossed to break the dam. The moon was a smear behind the snow, and the creek's voice had gone thick. Eleanor waited and felt the cold like 2 knives kissing bone. Saloli guided her footfalls to the stones that would not roll. Atsa moved ahead like a cat. They pulled rock by rock while the dark water tried to unseat them, and when it loosed at last, it did so all at once, and the current took their legs. Eleanor went under and tasted the old taste of winter water and fear, and hands hauled her back like pulling a calf from a slick berth. On the far bank, a trickle turned into a mouth, and the earth spit out a splinter of board with a nail rusted to a nub and a brass button that looked like a small sun that had forgotten its heat. Civil War issue, green at the edges. Atsa stared, caught between reverence and anger. "Bones," he said, and the word did not need a plural to carry the weight. Awe hung between them, the way fog hangs over a road you can't trust. Sister Agnes broke a seal and did not pretend she had the right to do it. She brought Eleanor to the small table by the stove and set the letter down and showed the broken wax and the place where the name had been cut so neat you could thread a ribbon through the hole. Reverend Pike said a benefactor would fix what needed fixing, she said. He said the man used other names like Coates, and that any name could be respectable if it had clean paper. I asked him what name I should write. He said, "Write the one that will stand when my wife needs it." He was not joking. Eleanor swallowed and felt how the swallow hurt. "I don't need a benefactor," she said. The sister said, "Kind, you need water that does not lie." Eleanor looked at the page again and saw something new, an oily smear on the fold that looked like someone had pressed a thumb where a thumb did not belong. She could not tell if it was Ezra's print rubbed to blur or a new one set atop the old. She thought of Harlan's letter with the cut name and felt the little hairs at her nape stand. Merritt came back with a piece of paper from an Arkansas sheriff who liked to believe paper could cross water without changing shape. He brought 3 riders who wanted coin to keep their hands warm. He spoke his orders in a voice that tried to sound like a man speaking to equals. and failed. "Deputy," he said, "you will arrest this man for murder." The mud tells the tale. Harlan had read enough tales written in mud to know how quickly rain can make them into different stories. He put his hand on Saloli's shoulder, the way a lawman puts a hand on a prisoner, and then he took it off and set his badge on a nail in Eleanor's half-made wall, and the little piece of tin looked more like truth hanging there than it did on his coat. He said, "Not tonight," and in that sentence he put every risk a man can fit. Merritt grinned with all his teeth and said, "You forget who pays for faces in this town, deputy?" The words were strange enough to make Eleanor glance at him sharp. In the root cellar that smelled like earth waiting for spring, Eleanor and Saloli argued with quiet voices that still cut. "Your law takes water and sells what it never owned," he said. "Your memory keeps water that can't pay the debt my husband made," she said. They were both right and both tired. She took the family Bible and opened to the last page, where Ezra's hand had written things tight to save paper. Births, debts, purchases, a calf sold for near nothing. The last line said, "Redeem the water by first snow," and the ink had a stain where the pen had blotted, and Ezra had tried to make it look like part of the letter, so no one would see his hand shake. She showed that to Saloli like an apology. He touched the blot with one finger and left no print because his hands were dry and clean. "My grandmother made a print once to save a man who did not know how to be saved," he said. "She said a thumb can be heavier than a name." The wind slammed the cellar door and flung it open. On the latch, a small leather thong had been tied to hold a pouch at eye level. The pouch Saloli kept his river stones in, the ones he told stories with when he wanted to explain a river's mood. It hung open, and inside lay a lock of hair, clotted, dark, and stiff. Eleanor knew it was not hers. Atsa took one look and stepped for the ladder. "Mean hands," he said again, and this time he did not make it a lament. He made it a promise. In Fort Smith, Hattie Vale licked a pencil to make the lead wake and totaled an undertaker's ledger with neat lines and small flourishes. She allowed herself only when the sums came out even. It was late, and the lamp smoked a little. She liked the quiet work, the way columns behaved, the way paper did not shout when a tally did not suit a man's feeling. She turned a page and paused. There it was again, a charge for 3 wax face covers, billed to Caleb Merritt. No bodies recorded, no dates that fit. She put a finger on the line and felt the paper rough from where too much ink had dried. She did not know Eleanor Pike. She did not know Saloli. She knew the look of grief bought in advance, and the way it stained a ledger, like fat stains brown paper. She set a ribbon at the page and closed the book, because the dead wake up in the mind if you stare too long at the places you prepared for them. Atsa slipped into the brush and came out with a scrap of talk he had taken off a man in the dark. Merritt meant to foul the creek with slaked lime at night, so the fish would rise belly up, and the water would burn the tongue, and no one would call it drink. Eleanor felt something that was not just fear stand up inside her, something that had a spine like a rail. "We hold the ridge," she said. Saloli looked at her like a mason looks at a stone that's been quarried wrong, but will do good work if you set it right. "Then we set anchors," he said. They hauled fallen cedar and drove cross pieces into the frozen soil like pegs, and they tied their wall to the earth with rope that sang when wind went through it. They dug a shallow trench where the wind would carry flame like a plow carries a blade. Harlan walked in with his badge in his pocket and his jaw set, and said he was there to serve an arrest. And then he set the warrant down on the hearth and said, "It can wait." And he looked ashamed and proud at the same time, which is a hard thing to look. Lightning spidered across the far hills without rain, and Merritt brought cattle as if hooves could try their wall, where papers had not. The animals bawled and pushed and snorted steam, and the quick dam he'd set upstream swelled a pond that looked black and heavy enough to lift a house. Atsa took a torch to the trench, and the flame took the way a fuse takes on a cannon, straight and hungry. It was the nearest thing to joy anyone had felt on that ridge in weeks, and even that joy wore fear's coat. Merritt rose in his stirrups, rifle lifting, and in the heartbeat before the shot, a fourth rider slid out of the timber and fired first. The coat on him flapped like something out of a grave, and it was a coat Eleanor knew, without thinking. The old duster Ezra had worn when the rain turned to sleet that last week. The one she had folded and set in the box under the bed, and then carried to the grave because she could not stand to see it hung without a man inside it. The impossible shape seemed to be her dead man riding, and for a breath she could not move, because grief had grabbed her by the throat and said, "See." The mare under the rider blew and turned sideways to the flames, and the man swung down heavy but sure and came forward with a gait that was not Ezra's, and yet did not care to hide it. He kept the coat like a banner, and held a small book that Eleanor recognized as Ezra's pocket ledger, where he had written each small debt and each small mercy. "Evening," he said. "I collect." The fire line hissed in the sleet. The cattle jammed out of the heat and turned back and tested the anchors. The wall held. The quick pond climbed. Harlan's breath sounded like a man who had climbed 3 flights and found there were more. Atsa shifted, and the world aimed a bullet at him, and the night began to tear under gunfire, and the ridge that had wanted to be left alone finally had to choose who stood on it when the choosing was done. The man in Ezra's coat cocked his head, like he heard a tune only he liked. He kept the little ledger dry under the flap, and that meant he knew the worth of paper in bad weather. He walked with his shoulders a little forward, not like a preacher, not like a cowhand, not like a deputy, like a man who spent his days near doors that open when his finger touches the latch. "You owe a river," he said to Eleanor, in a voice that did not try to be loud, and yet went through the noise, because it had the shape of command. "A river does not belong to a widow," Eleanor said, not because she wanted to argue, but because truth said itself when pushed. "It belongs to the living." He smiled like the answer pleased him. "Then I am in luck," he said, and he raised his hand, and the hired men shifted to draw, and Harlan shot one in the shoulder, because there are moments when a man with a badge has no decision to make at all if he wants to live with his own face in the mirror. Everything broke open. The fire trench roared when the wind shifted and poured flame toward the quick dam, and heat lifted the sleet and turned it to fog and then to steam that came off the leather coats like ghosts leaving. Atsa moved left and yelled once, when a round found him in the side. He pressed his hand to it and looked at the blood on his palm with a surprise that came because even the brave forget their bodies bleed like any body. Saloli dragged him back with one arm, and Atsa shoved him away because pride is a bandage men try before they accept cloth. "Don't pull me like a calf," he said through his teeth, and then a second shot tore bark off the cedar above his head and dusted both their faces with splinters. Merritt tried to aim, but his horse spun at the heat, and he cursed in a soft voice that said he had learned to curse among men who wore coats, and smiled while they did it. The man in Ezra's coat paced closer. Until the fire put a line on the ground, he would not step over. "Names don't matter," he said, "but debts do." Reverend Pike put his thumb to a note that said water would be mine if the snow came before his coin did. Snow came, coin did not. Paper holds. The spring and the ground are mine. I am the benefactor. I wear the coats of men who learned too late that paper takes the long way to a grave. Eleanor stared at the ledger in his hand and saw in a flash the last time Ezra had balanced it by lamplight, counting small credits and larger owing, licking his thumb to turn pages, and how she had wanted to take the booklet and set it in the stove and watch math make smoke. She lifted her chin. "You stole that coat," she said. "You dress in other men's skin and call it law." He laughed and bowed without bending much. "Law is a kind of coat," he said. "It keeps a man the right temperature in a cold place." Saloli saw the quick dam swell. He judged the rope and the anchors they had set. He saw where the water tried to crawl around the edge to make a new channel. He said, low, to Eleanor, "If we pull, the pond goes. It takes him, or it takes us." She looked at the cattle pressed against the wall, at the men in the steam, at Harlan reloading with hands that shook and still did it clean. "It can take both," she said. They moved as if the thought had always been theirs. Saloli slid to the upstream side and took his knife to the knot, cutting in quick, small strokes so the rope would not whip into his face. Eleanor threw her shoulder against a brace to make it hold 5 beats more. Atza, pale and set, put his boot on the anchor and pushed, like he meant to push the whole night back. Merritt saw the motion and screamed, "Hold the dam!" And one hired man turned to shoot Saloli and never got the sight because Harlan's second shot went where it needed to go and changed a man's mind about shooting forever. The knot went. The pond fell forward in a black sheet. It tore along the trench and threw steam high and took a saddle and a hat and tried to take a man. The benefactor stepped back and lost his footing and hit the mud on his elbow and grinned even while he slid, because some men enjoy a hazard the way mean boys enjoy telling lies. The water smacked the front rank of cattle and turned them, and 2 went down and got up in the wrong direction and made trouble for the men behind them. Merritt's horse went to its knees and found its feet and bolted, and Merritt clung and did not fall, and then he did, and the rifle went skidding, and Harlan kicked it into the shallows without looking noble about it. After the first crash, there is always a second smaller one. The dam belched, and another wave came, slower, lower, heavy. It hit the fire trench and filled it, and sent up a hissing like a snake that could not decide whether to be water or air. The steam made a curtain, and behind it, shapes moved like folk in a dream. Eleanor felt the ridge flex like a tooth. She tasted ash. She felt her own heart, and knew it would not let her stop, while the wall now tied to the earth called for her hands. The benefactor came through steam with the ledger held high, as if he thought water would honor paper, like a priest honors a Bible. He grinned at Eleanor with a kind attention that made her blood go cold. "Mrs. Pike," he said, "you are stubborn." "True," she said. "It is not a sin. Everything that keeps a person alive is a sin, if you ask the right man to name it," he said, and he moved to the right, because he was that kind of man. A bullet cracked the air between them and took a strip off the coat where it crossed his ribs. He looked there and then up and smiled wider. "Ezra sends regrets," he said, and in that moment Eleanor decided what she should have decided at noon when the badge had read papers. In sleet, she lunged and grabbed the ledger. He held it tight, and her hand closed over his, and they were skin to skin, with Ezra's numbers between. He wrenched and she stumbled, and in the stumble she slammed her shoulder into him and drove him toward the trench that now boiled like a kettle. He jerked back and found firm ground where the cedar roots knit the soil. "You will have a story," he said, calm, "and I will have a spring. That is a fair exchange." Atza groaned and slid to a sit with his back to the wall. Saloli was at him again, applying cloth torn from his own shirt and pressing in with the heel of his hand to make the red slow. "You hold," Saloli said, using the voice he used for stones. Atza said, "I am not stone," and he tried to smile and could not make it much of one. "You are when you need to be," Saloli said, which was the closest he would come to begging. Harlan took a deep breath and stood into the open, because sometimes a man must be seen to do what he knows will cost him. He held out his left hand, empty, palm up, and his right hand kept the gun low, not pointed at anyone, pointed at the ground like respect. "Merritt," he said, "hear me. The note is bad. The survey is bad. The sheriff's authority ends at the river he didn't cross. The only clean thing left is to walk away while you still have both legs under you." Merritt spat blood and sleet and laughed a little. "I paid you for your face," he said to Harlan. "I can pay again." Harlan flinched, like the words had more heat than the trench. "There's a bill for wax faces in Fort Smith with your name on it," he said. "You bought sorrow on paper before you'd earned it on the ground. You can't afford another one." The benefactor glanced at Merritt as if measuring the depth of a pocket. He shifted his attention back to Eleanor and to Saloli and to the wall, and there was calculation in his eyes that looked like the cold edge of a knife. "I don't need him," he said, almost kind. "I need the spring. I need that ledger to say what I want it to say. When it's read in a quiet office on a warm day," Eleanor said, "you can tear out pages. You can cut away names. You can smear a thumb until it looks like anybody's. But water remembers what paper forgets." He grinned. You sound like a preacher. I buried the only one I ever had, she said, and for the first time since he'd walked out of the timber, the grin fell off his face. They moved then, fast, and no one could later say who started it. The fourth rider, the benefactor, darted left. Saloli cut him off with a shoulder. Merritt lunged at Harlan and got the deputy's forearm in his throat, and the both of them went to the dirty snow and rolled and hit stones that were new to the ground and not yet settled into being stones of a wall. Eleanor snatched the ledger when it fell and hugged it to her chest and ran for the cellar, because some fights you win by putting a thing where the land will hold it for you. She slid the book into a crack between joists and laid a stone over the seam, because that is how you speak to a house you intend to live in, by asking it to keep what you cannot keep yourself. When she climbed back up, the benefactor met her at the top like an usher, polite, and she swung the iron skillet as hard as she could. It rang off his temple, and his eyes went soft and bright, and he smiled again, absurd, and then he shook his head like a dog. You have a hand, he said. You should have cooked for me, she said. I would sooner feed stones. He grabbed her wrist and twisted it, not vicious, professional, as if twisting wrists had always been part of his work. Pain went white. She dropped the skillet. He pulled her forward, and she did what a woman does when strength fails. She used the ground. She stomped his instep and drove her forehead into his nose, and felt it give, and his breath came out of him with a sound like a door ajar in a storm. She broke free. He swung once and hit her in the shoulder, and it made sparks in her vision and drove the breath out of her. She fell. He leaned over her, and she saw the underside of Ezra's coat and the stitches she had mended the winter before last, and she saw them now as scars on a body that was not her husband's. Saloli yelled her name and came like a hammer. He hit the man low and hard, and the two of them went into the slop where the fire had cooked the ground to a kind of clay that seized at the ankles. They rolled, and Saloli's hand found the pouch string at the man's neck and pulled, and a small thing dropped, a glass eye, brown, with a scratch across it. It hit the mud and stared at the sky. For a stupid, holy second, everyone saw it and believed it meant omen. The benefactor laughed as if someone had told the best joke he had heard. Took it off a man who did not need to, he said. Now I see farther. Saloli hit him again. The glass rolled into the trench and boiled. A shot cracked from the timber. Clean, not hurried. Atsa jerked and slumped, and then found himself somehow still in the world. The bullet had found meat and missed bone. He put both hands on the wound and held his own life in. He looked up at the sky because men do that. Harlan threw his empty pistol at the man who had shot and did not miss. It hit with a useless thud that still made the shooter blink, and that blink gave Harlan the breath he needed to get to his feet. He dove and dragged Atsa by the collar behind the hearthstones, where heat still licked through the cracks, and kept the boy from freezing. Stay angry, Harlan said. Anger is hot. Sister Agnes came in the dark with two boys from the mission, carrying a litter made of poles and a quilt she had told herself she would not give away, because quilts take time from hands that do not have it. She had heard gunfire carry along the river like news, and she had taken the ledger ribbon and tucked it into her sleeve, as if paper could lay a path a person might follow. I should not be here, she said, breathing hard. But if I am not, I will be writing names alone in the morning. She went first to Atsa and put her hand at his neck and then at his side and nodded, because there is a kind of blood that says yes, this can be turned back if somebody works. She called to one boy, boil bandages, and to the other, tell the cow to stand still, which is the kind of sentence that makes sense only in the dark when the world is wrong. She set her palm on Harlan's cheek and felt the heat and the wet and the shake, and did not waste words on any of it. The benefactor pulled away from Saloli with a twist that felt like a trick learned in a place where men traded holds in a ring for other men's coin. He came up with a knife that was not a cowboy's knife or a hunter's knife. It was a banker's knife, thin, meant to cut paper clean. He slashed Saloli across the forearm. Not deep mean. I do not kill stones, he said. I stack them. He stepped toward the trench, meaning to go around, and his boots sank to the ankle in the place where the cooled mud looked solid and was not. He cursed then, not soft, and in the curse was the first piece of truth he had offered to anyone that night. Eleanor picked up a length of brace and swung it like a paddle and caught him at the knee. He went down on both hands and laughed again, and then he spit blood, and the laugh had iron in it. "Mrs. Pike," he said, voice rough, "I could like you in a softer year." "I do not have softer years," she said. Merritt scrambled to his knees and saw what his money had bought and what it had not. He saw Harlan with the badge in his pocket and the warrant by the fire. He saw Sister Agnes binding a boy he had never looked at as anything but trouble. He saw Eleanor standing with a brace in her hands and mud to her shins and hair in her face and a welt on her cheek and a look that made him think of the first time a calf learns to stand and decides to run before it knows how. He went to his rifle in the shallows. Harlan saw and swore and threw himself and missed, and then grabbed the barrel as Merritt lifted it, and the two of them tugged like hungry men at a loaf of bread, and the loaf went off, and the shot hit the air and took nothing but sound, and they both fell, and Eleanor felt her knees go weak with the relief that comes only to be replaced by fear's next shape. The quick pond had gone, but the dam still held some water, and it pressed. Saloli saw the second knot, the one he had left, because you never cut everything at once unless you want nothing left at all. "Now," he said to Eleanor, and she nodded because she knew the word meant, "We choose the shape of our hurt." They both went to it and pulled. The knot gave with a jerk that tore skin. The last of the pond lifted, paused, and then came. It hit the trench and rolled it flat. Steam jumped and then died. The benefactor scrabbled and slipped and slid and came up sputtering and ugly and lost the last of his good looks. The mud made him plain as any man beside a ditch. Saloli stood over him with breath heaved and eyes dark and empty of everything but work. "Go," Saloli said. The benefactor wiped his mouth and sat back and then smiled small. "I never go when a ledger is open," he said, and the sound of it made Eleanor think of a door scraping stone. They fought to a standstill because sometimes the land itself makes the choice that men cannot. The steam thinned. The cattle found the gap and moved off because animals have more sense than men most nights. Merritt cursed himself and everyone he could name, and then did the smartest thing he had done all season. He put his hands up and said, "I am done," and he cried, not like a child, like a man who sees a table he is not invited to and knows he never will be. Harlan tied his wrists with a strap from his own gear and gave him a piece of dry cloth for his mouth, because a deputy has to remember the human part, or he is a different thing with a badge. The benefactor watched it all like a man at a theater who had seen the play before and still liked the scene with the rope. He stood, he shook his coat and put his knife away. He looked at the cellar door and at Eleanor and at the seam of stone and at the place where a ledger lay hidden under one rock, where a house's heart will beat if you ask it to. He amended his smile. "Mrs. Pike," he said, "this ends when a coroner writes my name clean on a fold you cannot stain." Eleanor said, "You will not have a name anyone believes." He tipped 2 fingers off an invisible hat and turned like a man late for supper. He whistled once, a city tune, and melted into the timber, with 2 hired men left intact enough to follow. Harlan started after him, and then stopped, because a deputy knows the difference between a chase that makes a story and a chase that makes a grave. He picked up his badge from the nail and did not pin it on. He tucked it into his breast pocket, where Eleanor could see it ride with his breath. Sister Agnes worked until the dark had a different feel, the feel it gets when a night is closer to morning than to the sunset that began it. She packed the wound and said a prayer that was not the kind that asks for miracles, but the kind that names the parts of a body, like it is calling roll. Atsa gripped her wrist once and said, "I did not want to help her, now I do," and closed his eyes again, because pain had decided to let him borrow sleep. "You will live to argue with yourself about it," Sister Agnes said, and Eleanor laughed a broken laugh, because the truth is, sometimes the only clean thing a person hears in a night. When the flame died, and the frost took back the edges of the world, Eleanor went to the cellar and brought the ledger up. She wiped the cover with her sleeve, and the mud left a dull smear that would always be there. She opened to the page where Ezra had written, "Redeem the water by first snow," and ran a finger under it, and did not cry, because her tears were tired of the kind of work. Harlan stood close enough to see the words, and not close enough to crowd a widow. "There is a line in my deposition," he said slowly, "that will not hold. I did not file the vacate when I should have. I held it to see if Wright could get a head start. If anyone asks, I will say the paper went missing in the sleet. Men will believe that because sleet is good at taking what you do not hold tight. But there is another line, words I wrote when I first started out, that says the deputy serves the truth the best way he can. That line has been erased so many times the paper is thin. Tonight, I will write it again." He looked at her, and there was a plea in it. "Let me make the words say what they should have said before." Eleanor nodded. "Right," she said, and he pulled a pencil and wrote on the inside cover, because sometimes the only place to write is the place where it will not be official and will be true. He wrote that Merritt's lien was under question, that the Springs served a community, that a thumbprint made in good faith outweighed a cut-out name made in a lightless room. He signed with the badge number, but not his name, because he had to choose between two kinds of courage, and he chose the one that kept him alive to do more work. When he finished, Sister Agnes put her own neat letters under his, and wrote that she had seen 2 bodies burned later than the bill that paid for wax faces, and that the wax could make a stranger's features look like a man folks expected to bury. She added a small cross, not as priest, but as nurse, which is a different office with its own kind of oath. Eleanor looked at the 3 of them, and at the boy sleeping, and at the wall that had lived through a night it should not have. She felt resolve move like a new joint in a mended bone. "We will finish the house tomorrow," she said, and then corrected herself, because tomorrow belongs to men who know what the sun will do. "We will finish the house when the light comes." Saloli nodded. "Stone for stone," he said. "Bread for bread," Eleanor said. "Creek for creek." And the 3 words did not taste like surrender when she said them. They tasted like water. A wind came that did not carry sleet. It carried the smell of wet ash and of the inside of leather and of something sweet she could not place. She realized it was the smell of cattle farther down, calm now that men had left them to their ideas. She breathed it and felt her heart step down into a slower gear. She thought of the undertaker's ledger in Fort Smith, with lines that did not match bodies. She thought of the cut-out name and the erased words, and of the way paper tended to tell the story of whoever held it last. She thought, too, of the parish register at the mission and the thumbprint that had been rubbed and smeared to make it look like anybody's. She lifted the ledger and pressed her own thumb into the muddy cover and left a print there, not as law, as memory. A little while before dawn, as the sky thought about light, a cow bellowed, the kind of sound that meant either birth or trouble. Sister Agnes looked up like a woman who keeps track of all the births within 2 days' ride, whether anyone asks her to or not. "We'll need milk for bandages and for a boy who'll wake hungry," she said. "Eleanor, can you hold her halter?" Eleanor glanced at the wall, and then at the boy, and then at the creek, and then at Saloli. "Go," he said, reading her count. "The stones will hold. They are warmer than they were." Eleanor went. The cow stood with steam coming off her back, and eyes rolling white, and an old scar across her flank she had not noticed in the rush of night. Eleanor set her hand on the neck and talked nonsense and comfort, because it works the same on cattle as on children, and sometimes on men. Sister Agnes drew milk into a pail with quick, expert pulls. The simple work steadied them all in a way nothing else could have done. When the first color laid a thin ribbon over the hills, Harlan squinted at it like a man trying to see the shape of an answer. He turned to Eleanor. "There's a line in the undertaker's bill," he said, and his voice went into that other register the truth uses when it is about to tell itself whether anyone wants it to or not. "On the undertaker's bill, There's a charge no one could explain. Next, you will learn who paid it and why." He looked down at Merritt, wrists bound, shivering spite and cold. He looked at the place where the benefactor had gone and where the trees seemed closer than they had been. "I reckon we will have to go to Fort Smith and set the papers where they cannot be moved by rain or by men with coats." Eleanor nodded. "We'll go," she said. "We'll bring the ledger and the thumbprint, and the boy who lived, and the man who kept his badge in his pocket when it mattered." The ridge settled. The creek carried away the last of the lime and the ash, and brought down a twig with a small green bud that had no business showing itself in such a week. Eleanor watched it turn and snag against a stone and lodge there. She did not call it a sign because signs are for people who expect to be answered. She called it a thing to look at while she finished a wall. She put her hand on the top course and felt the cold in the stone begin to ease under the small heat of a woman's palm. They broke camp when the light was honest enough to tell stone from ice. Eleanor packed the ledger in a flour sack and tied it under her coat, where body heat would keep the damp from turning pages to glue. Harlan fetched the horses Merritt's men had left, tied in the timber, and chose the calmest for Sister Agnes, and the litter. Atsa, gray but set, insisted on walking to the creek and touching the water with his left hand before they lifted him onto the poles. "It remembers," he said, and Eleanor felt that in her throat. Saloli stood at the wall and placed his palm flat as if blessing. "Hold," he told it. The stones said nothing in words, and yet their silence felt like consent. Merritt rode with his wrists bound to his saddle horn. He kept his eyes hard on the horizon, not on the faces near him, because a man who has to live through a long day cannot look at what he has made close up. They took the river path toward Fort Smith, a thin track where frost shines like mica. The benefactor had gone somewhere that made the trees watchful. Harlan rode point and kept his head on a swivel. Once a buck stepped out, black nose wet, and stared without fear, and Eleanor thought of the glass eye, boiling, and shuddered, because the mind makes loose ropes between things when it is tired. Midway, a rutted wagon found them, driven by a man with a parson's hat and a gambler's coat and a nervous hand. He looked at Merritt and then passed him quickly. "Road's worse ahead," he said. Bridge gave up its nails. Harlan nodded and peeled off up a ridge spur he knew from a year when he'd chased a horse thief and found only the thief's mother and a kettle of beans. They climbed, the litter bearers grunting soft, the poles creaking. Sister Agnes walked close, counting under her breath like stitches. Fort Smith rose like a set of square teeth against a low sky. The smell of tallow, sawdust, and river mud sat over the street. Harlan's boots sounded like duty on the planked walk. He led them straight to Vale Undertaking, a narrow front with a window painted in gold leaf that had dulled. Hattie Vale looked up from a table where she was pinning a lining into a pine box. Her hair was tied with a strip of muslin. She saw the shape of the party: 2 rough men, a woman with a face like flint, a boy too pale, a bound ranch heir, a deputy who did not wear his badge, and a sister with a jaw you could trust to hold a story. And she wiped her hands and said, "Don't bleed on the boards if you can help it." Her voice had a dry kindness. Harlan set Merritt on a chair and stood him like furniture. "Miss Vale," he said, and the title made her smile because men rarely remembered it. "We need to see your ledger for last week and the week before. I will need to sign for the removal, and I will need to write on a separate sheet why I am asking for what I am asking." Hattie tilted her head, weighing cost. "Deputy, the dead mind their privacy same as the living," she said, "but papers for light, not for dark corners. If there's a dark corner, I'd rather sweep it." She brought out the ledger with the ribbon he'd never seen, but somehow expected. Red, thin, careful. She opened to the page where she'd put her finger night before and pointed with one clean nail. 3 wax face covers, she read. Billed to Caleb Merritt. No bodies. No names. Merritt tried to tip the chair and fell sideways with the clatter of a man who has not practiced shame. Harlan righted him and did not look at him again. Eleanor set her thumb on the page edge to keep it open and felt the paper grit where ink had dried, too thick. "Who paid?" she asked. Hattie looked toward the back room where a clock ticked like a small heart. A man who called himself Sanford, coat too fine for his boots, left coin, and wanted the bill made to Merritt because the ranch handles grief. I saw a glass eye in his pocket, she added without drama. The room breathed once, in. He said a face needs a story, when there's not enough face left to make one. A young clerk from the coroner's office walked past the door, pen behind his ear and a folded packet under his arm. Harlan stepped out and put a steady hand on the man's sleeve. "We need the inquest from the ridge," he said. The clerk, who had learned briskness to keep from feeling slow, frowned. "It's not signed yet," he said. "The fold's still wet." Harlan held out his palm. The clerk hesitated and then gave over, because the deputy's voice had the weight of a man who'd buried more than one badge. Harlan took the packet and broke the tie and unfolded the stained paper. The fold was indeed dark where someone's thumb had worried it too soon. He read aloud because reading makes words heavier. 2 bodies recovered with severe burns. One identified by a fused ring on the 4th finger of the right hand as Caleb Merritt. He looked up and then down. "But Caleb Merritt is here," he said, flat. The clerk blinked. "That's what the benefactor wanted," Hattie said quick. A wax face on a body he could call Merritt to put an end to questions. And he wanted the other body to be anyone but himself. Sister Agnes took the page, held it near the window's thin light, and traced a small smear with her thumb. "Same oil as on the mission register," she said. "Same careless haste." Eleanor felt heat at the back of her neck. "He is building a grave out of paper," she said. Harlan nodded. "Then we will build a wall out of paper. We will put stones in it. He cannot move." He pulled his pencil. On a separate sheet, he wrote a deposition that did not fall into the old ruts. He wrote that one body had been misidentified by intention, that an undertaker had a bill marked before death, that a deputy had withheld a vacate to prevent a greater wrong, that a ranch heir stood bodily present bound to a chair, that a woman's ledger and a sister's register held the line where truth should sit. He kept it lean, because adjectives give liars a place to hide. The benefactor walked in with his hat in his hand and the glass empty socket, where an eye should be hidden under brow. He had wiped most of the mud off and looked like a man on his way to a meeting about the price of flour. He slouched with a city man's ease and nodded to Hattie as if they had shared coffee in another life. "Miss Vale," he said. "Deputy, Sister, Mrs. Pike, Mr. Merritt." He listed them like a man calling a roll, and there was satisfaction in it, because he liked to see the pieces set on the board. Harlan took half a step toward his gun, and then did not, because the benefactor had come for paper, not for blood, and men like him cut throats with signatures. "I hear there is confusion," the benefactor said lightly. "I came to help confusion find its bed." He pulled from his coat a new sheaf, bearing a Fort Smith seal, pressed in hurry, and slapped it on Hattie's table with friendly force. "Agreement of transfer," he said. "Water rights, Springhead, and improvements thereon conveyed to me for value given. Caleb, you will be pleased to see I have taken care of your affairs." Merritt made a sound like a broken hinge. "I did not sign," he said. The benefactor's grin sawed tight. "You intended to." "Intention signs quite well here," he said, tapping the seal. And Eleanor understood then the exact flavor of men who call themselves benefactors. It tastes like iron, drawn over the tongue. Eleanor set both hands on the table and leaned forward until they were almost close enough to share breath. "You cut a name out of a missionary letter," she said. "You pressed a thumb that was not yours onto a debt." He laughed softly. "Names are heavy," he said. "Thumbs are anonymous. That is their appeal." He glanced at Sister Agnes. "Madame, your careful books will say what I wish when I am done. That is their duty." Sister Agnes kept her palms cool on the wood. "My books serve the living," she said, and it was the most dangerous sentence in the room. He tipped the hat and put it back on, like the small act might change the air. "Then let us settle this in front of the judge," he said, smiling at Harlan with a friendliness that tasted like a blade. "We will go now. I like my mornings to end with resolutions." The courtroom took light from high windows that made faces look stern. The judge's hair had learned white early and had not changed its mind. He read quick, mouth tight, unhappy to have to untangle other men's knots before he had his midday broth. Harlan laid the deposition. Hattie set the ledger. Sister Agnes produced the register with the thumbprint. Eleanor set Ezra's pocketbook on top, like a stone that would keep papers from sliding. The benefactor presented the transfer agreement, with its seal still warm, and a witness who swore, with the easy fluency of a man who had practiced in glass and in smoke. Merritt slouched and tried to shrink, and could not. The judge stacked and unstacked, scowled when the undertaker's bill did not fit, frowned deeper at the coroner's stain, pursed his lips at the cut letter, and looked exhausted when he saw the hole where a benefactor's name should have sat. "I prefer when facts have edges," he said. "These are soft." Eleanor stepped one pace. "They are soft because a man pressed his thumb on them until they blurred," she said. He looked at her like a teacher looks at a pupil who has spoken truth without asking leave. "You have a mouth on you, Mrs. Pike," he said. "Keep using it until it costs you." The benefactor's attorney, a neat worm of a man with a voice that never hit a stone, rose and spoke about equitable interests and customary usages and cross-jurisdictional comedy, and the judge pretended to listen until the worm had to breathe. Harlan took that breath to speak. On the sheriff's deposition, one line was erased. He said, steady, "Next you will hear the words they tried to destroy." He read from the first draft he had kept in his pocket, the one that named the spring a common necessity, not a single asset, and he laid under it Sister Agnes's line about a thumbprint made in good faith. Hattie slid her ledger forward and planted a finger on the words, "wax face covers," and the judge's eyes flicked and stayed. "Why would a man order faces for the dead before the dead have died?" he asked. No one answered, which was answer enough. Merritt made a small sobbing noise, and then bit it off because even ruin has habits. The judge turned to the benefactor. "Sir, I do not like artifice," he said. "It looks bad on cold days." The benefactor smiled his best good smile. "Judge, what you call artifice, I call arrangements. The West runs on them." "Not in my room," the judge said, and it sounded like iron on iron. He took up the agreement, held it to the light, saw the seal was right, and the ink was wrong. "This is the right kind of stamp on the wrong kind of day," he said, and tore it twice. Neat. Gasps went around the room like summer hail. The benefactor did not blink. "Tear paper," he said. "Water is not paper." "No," the judge said, "but a woman is not paper either, nor is a tribe, nor is a creek. The spring is held in common until proper survey and proper agreement passed, in open day, and witnessed. Deputy, see to it people go home alive today." He rapped his gavel once, like a nail driven clean. They left the court with a feeling that had edges again. On the steps, the benefactor stood close. "You have cost me time," he said to Eleanor, in a voice you would use on a friend you meant to hurt. "Time is coin, then pay it," she said. He touched the brim and walked away without turning, as if he had forgotten them while they watched him go. Harlan let out a breath he had been holding since sleet. "He is not done," he said. "Men like that like long games." Saloli's eyes were on the river. "Then we build a longer wall," he said. "They took Atsa home first, because a boy's life has to be banked like a fire, or the rest becomes talk." Sister Agnes rode beside the litter and told stories that kept a mind where the body needed it. The ridge looked different when they returned. The wind had shifted. The wall had dried, where the heat bedding had done its work. There was a new break in the upstream bank, where the dam had let loose. A hawk circled, not as omen, but as fact. Eleanor felt her ribs loosen. They set Atsa in Eleanor's bed, because a house claims you when you let it, finished or not. Harlan made coffee that tasted like burnt rope, and Eleanor drank it gratefully because warmth is warmth. Merritt asked to piss, and they took him to a tree and untied one wrist and left the other bound, because they had learned to trust part of a man at a time. In the calming light, the truth about the bloody hair came quiet. Saloli stood by the tree line holding the pouch that had been used to frame him. He turned the thong in his fingers. "This hair is mare hair," he said. "Coarse, dyed dark. Men think all dark hair is the same." He plucked a strand from the tail of Merritt's bay and held them together. "Mean hands," Atsa croaked from the bed. "And even hurt," He smiled a little because he liked when facts proved the insult he had used first. Eleanor felt something lift out of her shoulders, a weight shaped like suspicion. She put a palm on Saloli's forearm, where the knife had scored him. "I am sorry I wondered," she said. He looked at her, and in that look were the pieces of a trust they had both been sawing at, with the wrong tools, and now had to fit new. Sister Agnes came to the doorway with the mission register and set it on the sill, like a relic. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the thumbprint." She turned to a page written 10 winters back, when Saloli's grandmother had come to the mission to barter woven belts for salt. There on the margin was her print, left by accident when she set her thumb in spilled ink. The whorls matched the smeared print in the water rights note the sister had copied, in a way that made Eleanor's skin prickle. "She pressed to save a man who could not pay," Sister Agnes said softly. She meant the water to be held as gadugi, not as a thing to be fenced. "The smudge is the same because the hand is the same. The stain on the coroner's fold is the same oil from the same cheap lamp. The night the benefactor worked his trade, he worked by lamplight, where a nun keeps her paper." Eleanor felt tears then, the kind that come not from grief, but from seeing a story come bare. "So it is kin," she said. "The spring has a family." They went to the bend, where the brass button had lodged, and where the bones had lifted. They dug with clean hands, and said the words you say when you do not know the names of the dead. They found the skull's flat homespun cap, still holding a pin, and Sister Agnes held it and made a cross in the air without moving her feet. They laid Atsa's brass button in the hand of the buried man like an exchange piece, because the living owe the dead small coins of respect that spend well on both sides. Harlan cut a hewn plank and burned with a hot iron the date and a line, found and faced. Eleanor spoke a name into the air for the stranger. "We will call you Done with Fire," she said. "You are not unlucky anymore." They finished the wall. It was work that made hands raw and souls easy. Each stone found its bed, and Eleanor learned the patience of tapping and listening. Saloli taught her to hear when a rock says it wants to lie a certain way. She laughed once, startled at the joy of something fitting where it belongs. Harlan set the doorframe with a carpenter's eye he had not used since before the badge. Merritt watched from a stump and found a tear on his face and wiped it with his shoulder because there was no hand for it. He spoke at last. "My father used to set stone too," he said hoarsely. He drank after. No one answered. Somewhere in the afternoon a cloud moved and a bruise of sun worked across the ridge. The creek's voice settled into steady talk. When the roof went on and the fire was laid and smoke climbed right for once, Eleanor called them all to the threshold. She held the last doorstone and looked at it and felt all the hands in it. Hers, Saloli's, Harlan's, Sister Agnes's, even Atsa's. She carved with a nail the mark she had chosen with herself in the night, her name, and beside it a small circle with radiating lines, the riverstone symbol Saloli carried. "Eleanor Pike," she said, plain. "Fox Ridge." She set the stone and pressed it, and the mortar took like an oath. Sister Agnes read from the mission register in a voice that did not tremble. "Water redeemed, by the living, for the living," and wrote it there on a slip that she tucked behind the lintel, because some words belong in wood. The benefactor did not come that evening, which was the surest way of knowing he would. He came when the frost made breath white and hooves loud. He came alone because he liked what theater silence could give a man. He stood beyond the new wall and admired it without saying so. "You built something," he said, "stone by stone." "We did," Eleanor said. "It is ours." He shrugged. "Everything is ours for a while." He looked at Atsa standing, gray but up, and at Harlan with his badge visible again, and at Sister Agnes with her register under one arm, and at Saloli with dried blood at the cuff, and at Eleanor with mortar on her cheek like war paint. He smiled, tired almost. "I thought I would win and go," he said. "Sometimes the going is the winning. Sometimes the staying is," Eleanor said. He stepped forward, and in his hand was a paper knife, narrow and quick. "I have been generous," he said in a voice that carried the shape of a threat, the way a sheath carries a blade. Give me the ledger, and I will leave your stones. Keep it, and I will cut night into you until you forget your own names." Slowly moved to step between. Eleanor put a hand on his shoulder and stepped herself. "I have been cut," she said. "I learned the pattern. It does not scare me like it did." He came close enough that she could see the scratch where the glass eye had once kissed his skin. He reached, fast. Eleanor dropped, drove her shoulder into his hip, and took him through the door, into the house that was not quite dry yet. They hit the clay floor. He rolled like a man who had learned to fight, where floors were polished and smooth. The clay slowed him, which pleased Eleanor, in a piece of her that had become mean enough to enjoy physics. He swung the knife. It cut her sleeve, not skin. Harlan fired once into the hearthstone, because warning shots do teach. The benefactor flinched at the ring, slowly took his wrist and locked it. Sister Agnes stepped in and put her palm flat on the man's chest, and said in the voice she used when a patient thought he would stand and could not, "No more." The word hit him like a slap, with no hand. He laughed then, a small laugh that had no joy in it, only relief that the scene had finally reached its end. "You will kill me," he said, "and you'll join me in paper. I will be your story, and the spring will be mine anyway, because no one can tell it right from wrong." Eleanor took a breath that went to the bottom of her and came back. "We will not kill you," she said. "We will name you." She stepped to the threshold and called out into the cold, like she was calling a child. Hattie Vale, who had come up the path with a small sack and a big question, appeared in the doorway as if summoned by a ledger. "Miss Vale," Eleanor said, steady. "Write this." Hattie pulled chalk from her pocket, as if she had always known she would use it on a doorstone. "Write what?" "Write that a man came to steal a spring and failed," Eleanor said. "Write that a badge served truth the best way he could. Write that a thumbprint saved what a name tried to take. Write that a boy bled and lived. Write that a nun held witness. Write that a widow built a house with help. Write that the man who called himself benefactor will take another name now. He will be called a man who left." Hattie's hand moved quick. The chalk whispered. The benefactor's face changed in a small way, like a man seeing himself older than he felt. He jerked once more and then stopped. "You will tire of guarding paper," he said, almost sad. "We will not," Sister Agnes said. "We like long work." He looked at her and saw that she was the kind of woman who lives long enough for patience to be its own revenge. He looked at Harlan and saw a man who would get up and keep getting up for years. He looked at Slowly and saw stone. He looked at Eleanor and saw a door that would not open unless it meant to. "I do not get to keep the coat," he said lightly, tugging the lapel where her neat repair showed. Eleanor shook her head. "You may leave it," she said. He shrugged out of it, not careless now, almost tender, and handed it to her like a folded flag. She took it and pressed it once to her face, smelling rain from 2 winters ago, and then set it on a peg. "Go," she said. He did. Morning came thin and merciful. The coroner came with his clipboard and his soft hat, and took down their words while standing on the frozen yard. He balked at writing what did not fit his templates, and then wrote it anyway, because the cold was a teacher. He folded the page. The stain along the fold looked like a bruise that would fade. Harlan signed, and this time put his name neat. "I will carry the badge in my pocket on days when my face is weak," he said to Eleanor, and there was no apology left in it, just a method. She touched the pocket lightly. "Do it like that," she said. They buried Atsa's blood in the bend. The bandage burned to ash and scattered. The brass button set in his palm for luck, like a small sun. He stood without swaying and said nothing for a long breath, which is one language grief speaks. Then he said to Eleanor, "I said no. I will say yes when it is hard next time." She nodded. "I will not forget," she said. Slowly knelt and set 3 river stones at the burial edge, 1 white, 1 red, 1 black. "For snow," he said. "For blood. For the night we used right." The creek murmured and took a small stick and turned it, and let it lodge with the budded twig from before. A hawk crossed the sky and did not look down. The house held its heat. Eleanor cooked beans and cornbread, and the smell of them filled the one room like a prayer people could eat. Merritt refused at first, and then took a bowl, and ate slow, with his bound hands, and began to cry, in the way men do, when salt water finally agrees to come out the eyes, instead of staying in the chest and making the breath hard. Harlan untied him, and told him to stay within the yard, or he would wear irons to Fort Smith, and tell his story, wearing the wrong kind of clink. Merritt nodded, and sat on the step, and watched his own boots like they were strangers. Sister Agnes wrote on the mission register, the pact they had decided without pomp, the spring held in, common under witness of the mission and the deputy and the Cherokee clan, for the use of the living and the tending of the dead. She inked the thumbprint left years ago, without making it prettier than it was. She did not add names, the page did not want. Hattie took the undertaker's ledger back to town, with a new line under the wax faces. Charge reversed. No body. She underlined it twice because some lies need 2 lines to cross them out. The coroner signed his inquest and left the fold to dry, without pressing his thumb where it did not belong. That evening, Eleanor sat at the threshold and watched the ridge change color with a piece she'd only tasted in seconds before. Saloli came and sat beside her and did not speak, because some silences are full of talk. You could have left, she said after a time. You did not. He thought a while. I left once when a wall fell, he said. I do not leave now when a wall stands. She looked at his hands, at the small nicks, at the healed places. Do you carry any stones now? He lifted the pouch and shook it. It clacked quiet. 1 for every name that holds, he said. He spilled them into his palm. There were 4 new ones, round and simple. He set one on the doorstone, pressed it, as if making a fix. This is yours, he said. It stays until the creek says otherwise. She placed her thumb on it and felt the cool. It warmed under her skin. When it was fully dark and the fire made the room a living thing, Eleanor took Ezra's coat off the peg and shook it and looked at the mended places. She thought of the man who had worn it and of the man who had tried to wear it, and she felt a forgiveness that did not excuse anyone. She folded the coat and set it in the chest. She laid on top of it the ledger with the muddy thumbprint and Harlan's pencil line and Sister Agnes's cross. She closed the lid. She breathed. Outside, the creek kept speaking the way creeks speak when they are not worried they will be silenced. This story began with sleet and a wall falling. It ends with stone holding and water shared and a man without an eye walking away because no one needed to fire another shot to make him small. If you look in the court packet in Fort Smith, you will find a page with a cut name and a new line written clean beside it, and you will see why the cut matters less than the line. If you turn the undertaker's ledger, a charge sits reversed, where grief tried to be bought ahead of time and failed. If you open the mission register, a thumbprint dark as a river rock says whose hand the spring remembers, and it is not a single name. If the ledger speaks again, you'll know which page to open first.